Hello, it's Philip Taylor from Richmond Green Chambers. I'm talking about my favourite subject, the Human Rights Act. And we've got a new book. Many of you will have seen this book before. This is the new edition, the third edition, just out, the end of 2008, beginning of 2009, but it's just recently in the actual bookshops from about May 2009. It's Human Rights, Law and Practice, third edition, by Lester, Pannick and Herberg. Now, I've written a review which is on Flickr. There'll be a lot of stuff on the internet itself. This is the book. It's a long, thin green book. It's quite heavy. It's got about 1,200 pages, in fact slightly less than that, but it follows the standard format, a huge amount of case law at the beginning, slightly different paragraph organisation with paragraph numbers there rather than at the side, and an excellent index at the back. Now let's have a look at the book. I've given it the title, The Fastest Developing Area of Jurisprudence, taken after what Lord Phillip said in the actual preface at the beginning of the book. What we're talking about here is a review effectively of how the law and practice, how the actual act operates. Because since its enactment in 1998, which is a year when future historians will probably see this as a point of a watershed, if you like, in the saga of human progress, the European Convention on Human Rights has now had a widespread and profound effect on the legal and indeed social landscape of the United Kingdom, having now been implemented in the substantive law of this country. Hitherto, Margaret Thatcher and the Conservatives had just accepted it, and obviously we signed up to the Universal Declaration 60 odd years ago, and we've agreed to the convention, but we didn't incorporate it in the substantive law. It now has, and it's affected everything that we do. Unlike much of the other legislation we've had, therefore, which passes by unnoticed and unremarked upon by the public, the Human Rights Act has a familiarity for everybody. Everybody knows about it, everybody has an opinion about it. Some bless its existence and others wish it would just go away. I'm in neither camp. I like the legislation. I want to see a slightly better, more well thought out piece of legislation for the future. I respect what Jack Straw has tried to do, but it needs to be reviewed, and that's going to be for a future government from 2010. It's interesting to note that the human rights issue continues to be controversial, not necessarily because of the intent or the content of the legislation itself, but because of the continuing propensity of individuals, both laymen and indeed some practitioners, to misunderstand and misinterpret it, sometimes deliberately. For instance, "I've got rights," cry the disaffected as well as the ignorant, often with little insight into or regard for their corresponding responsibilities. When I was teaching this, I reminded the learners you've got to have a balance between the two. So what exactly are our rights? Well, they're contained really in how we go about enforcing them and reviewing them in this work. We talk about entitlements under the legislation and what the limits and limitations will be. So anyone seeking answers, therefore, as well as an in-depth and accurate understanding of the legislation, obviously needs to read this book, which there are other ones, but this is one of the best and one of the deepest and most well thought out of the works available currently. In the foreword, right at the beginning, Lord Phillip sums up the work, quote, as a work of general excellence, referring to its many and learned contributors as familiar figures at the coalface, who together have produced, quote, a thorough and yet eclectic survey of the case law that they have presented. Well, obviously one of the things about the Act when it came in, I remember the day, I remember when Straw introduced the Act and when it became actually in force, that October day. And we didn't know what would happen. We soon found out that not a great deal happened. because obviously it's taken a long time for people to come to grips with it, because it's an important fabric of our society, effectively, because we go all the way back to Magna Carta when we look at the roles of the state versus the rights of the individuals. As for the controversial aspects, let's look at them for a minute. We're talking here about the legislation itself and the continuing tendency, I would suggest, to misapply it, because the preface actually reminds us that human rights have become, on too many occasions, an excuse for incompetent administrators. In other words, a rallying cry for irresponsible journalists, or a weapon for partisan politicians to use. And an example is given of a car thief who clambered onto a roof to evade arrest, threw missiles at police officers and refused to come down. During the subsequent siege, the officers supplied him with a takeaway meal, a soft drink and cigarettes, so as to ensure his human rights. We hope, say the editors, that this book may throw useful light on the true potential and limits of human rights. You see the problem? I mean, is that really what we intended to do? Well, some people might, but you've got to have a balance between the rights of people and responsibilities in the community. Is it responsible to do what the criminal was doing? Think of it, and you have your own view, certainly jurisprudentially. So of particular interest, therefore, to the layman as well as lawyers is the section on the history and the context of the Act today, as well as its articles, protocols, and the things from right to life to protection of prohibition from torture, slavery, forced labour, to the right to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and so forth. More the preserve of practitioners, probably, is the section on the principles of interpretation, extremely useful here. As the authors have pointed out, the three main ones, plus all a great list of contributors, human rights have their true potential, and certainly their limits, obviously, as set out in these books, because at the moment there's nothing that is an all-encompassing answer to the problems that are thrown up with the issue of human rights. What's notable is not what you can do under the legislation, therefore, but what you can't do. And I think that is probably the best way of looking at our relationship as people with the state. Now, in its third edition, then, this book by Tony Lester, David Pannick and Javin Herberg is an excellent addition to your library, in my view. It is the definitive and authoritative work. It's the law as stated at the beginning of 2009, and it's vital to have on your shelf, in my view, especially bearing in mind what I said right at the beginning, and that is that Lord Phillips observes the law of human rights is also the fastest developing area of jurisprudence. I'm sure it's going to continue that way, and we're going to have another Bill of Rights and Responsibilities. But thank you, gentlemen, for an excellent third edition, and also thank you to LexisNexis and Butterworths for supplying this to us as practitioners. Bye-bye.